Yeah, I think stuff to do with family overwhelms me quite a bit. You know, worry or stress around family side of things, that does overwhelm me quite a bit. But in terms of...
The palace has officially confirmed terrifying news about Prince William's health, leaving the nation in shock. What began as quiet concern has now turned into a wave of fear and uncertainty across the royal family. His condition remains unclear, but the tension is growing by the hour. What happened to the future king, and is he truly safe? The moment everything stopped. William has already established himself as a pillar of the monarchy and the future king. His calendar was full, his stride confident, his laughter genuine. Nobody suspected that within hours, the walls of the palace would echo with desperate voices and hurried footsteps. He had attended 3 engagements that week alone. At each one, cameras captured his easy charm and natural grace. He spoke about community projects, listened to concerns, and posed for photographs. There was no sign of weakness, no hint of what was coming. He was simply doing what he had always done, serving with quiet strength. Then came Thursday afternoon. The private meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock. Staff members gathered in the West drawing room, notebooks ready, agendas printed. William entered right on time, exchanging pleasantries as he took his seat at the head of the table. The discussion began normally. Minutes passed. Then something changed. His face went pale. His hand reached for the edge of the table. Before anyone could process what was happening, he slumped forward. "Your Royal Highness!" The room erupted into chaos. Aides rushed to his side, chairs scraping against the polished floor. Someone was shouting for help. Another was already on the phone, fingers shaking as they dialed. William lay motionless, his breathing shallow, his usual composure completely shattered. Within seconds, security flooded the corridor. Doors were sealed. The palace, usually a place of order and protocol, transformed into something else entirely, a place of fear. Kate was in another wing when she heard. She was reviewing plans for an upcoming visit, pen in hand, when her private secretary burst through the door. The woman's face said everything before her words could. "It's William." Kate didn't walk. She ran. Through hallways lined with portraits of ancestors who had faced their own crises, past staff members who stepped aside with worried expressions, toward the room where her husband lay, surrounded by people trying to help him. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. When she reached him, the world seemed to tilt. This was William. Strong, steady William, lying there looking so vulnerable. She dropped to her knees beside him, taking his hand, her eyes filled with tears she couldn't control. "Please," she whispered, "please be okay." The palace doctor arrived within minutes, medical bag in hand, expression serious. He worked quickly while everyone watched, frozen and helpless. Questions hung in the air, unspoken but deafening. What happened? How bad is it? Will he be all right? Outside, beyond the locked gates and guarded entrances, the world continued as normal. People went about their day, completely unaware that inside those ancient walls, everything was falling apart. The medical team made their assessment. An ambulance was called discreetly, entering through private gates away from public view. William was carefully lifted onto a stretcher. Kate refused to leave his side, climbing into the ambulance with him, her face streaked with tears. News began to spread through the palace staff like wildfire, whispers in corridors, worried glances. Everyone knew something terrible had happened, but nobody knew exactly what. Security protocols tightened further. Phone lines buzzed with urgent communications. Senior advisors were summoned. The machinery of crisis management kicked into gear. By evening, what had begun as a private emergency could no longer be contained. Word had leaked beyond the palace walls. News outlets started making calls. Social media began buzzing with rumors. The pressure to make a statement grew overwhelming. Inside the hospital, Kate sat beside William's bed, holding his hand as doctors ran tests. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't slept. She had barely moved. Her mind raced through possibilities, each one more frightening than the last. The results came back. The doctors delivered their verdict with careful words and grave expressions. Kate listened, her world narrowing to that single moment. Everything she had known, everything she had planned, every assumption about the future, all of it crumbled. That night, alone in a hospital chair with William sleeping nearby, Kate understood something profound. Life could change in an instant. Strength could vanish in a heartbeat. Nothing was guaranteed. So how did the public cope with this sudden weight? Stay with us. When the walls held their breath. The silence inside Kensington Palace was different now. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of evening routines or the calm between royal engagements. Kate sat in the chair beside William's bed, her hand wrapped around his. She hadn't moved in hours. Her eyes were red and swollen, fixed on his face as though watching him might somehow keep him safe. Every few minutes, she would lean forward and whisper something only he could hear. Sometimes his fingers would twitch slightly in response, sometimes there was nothing. The doctors had set up equipment around the room, monitors beeping softly in rhythm with William's heartbeat. That sound became Kate's anchor, proof that he was still here, still fighting, still breathing. She counted the beeps when the fear became too much. Outside the room, cars began arriving through the private gates. First came King Charles and Queen Camilla, their faces grave as they hurried inside. Charles moved faster than usual, his composure slipping with every step. When he reached the bedroom door, he paused, his hand on the frame, gathering himself before entering. The sight of his son lying there, pale and still, nearly broke him. Charles approached slowly, his eyes glistening. He placed a hand on William's shoulder, gentle and full of a father's helpless love. "My boy," he said quietly. Kate looked up at him, and without words, they understood each other's pain. Charles pulled up another chair beside her, and together they kept watch. Princess Anne arrived next, practical and steady as always, but even she couldn't hide the worry etched into her features. She spoke briefly with the medical team, asking sharp questions, demanding clear answers. She needed facts, information, something to hold on to in the chaos. The doctors gathered the family in an adjoining room. Their voices were low and measured as they explained what had happened. Medical terms filled the air: complications, stress factors, underlying conditions that had gone unnoticed. William's body had been pushing beyond its limits, carrying burdens that had slowly taken their toll. The collapse wasn't random. It was his body's way of saying enough. Charles listened, his jaw tight, his hands clasped so hard his knuckles turned white. When the doctors finished, he turned away, pressing his palm against the window pane. "He's too young for this," Charles whispered, his voice cracking. "I never wanted this weight on his shoulders so soon." The guilt in his words hung heavy. A father looking at his son and wishing he could carry the burden instead, wishing he could turn back time and shield him from the demands and expectations that came with being who they were. Camilla placed a hand on his arm, offering quiet comfort. There were no easy words for moments like this. Back in the bedroom, Kate continued her vigil. She thought about their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, who were being cared for elsewhere in the palace, kept away from the crisis but feeling its weight nonetheless. She thought about the life they had built, the plans they had made, the future they had imagined. Everything felt uncertain now. In the offices below, aides scrambled to manage what had become an impossible situation. The private emergency had leaked, and now the entire world was watching. Phone lines lit up constantly. Email inboxes overflowed. The pressure to release an official statement grew with each passing hour. They drafted versions, deleted them, and started over. How do you tell a nation that its future king is fighting for his health? How do you balance truth with privacy, transparency with dignity? Every word mattered. Every phrase would be analyzed and dissected. Finally, as evening turned to night, the announcement went out. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. News channels interrupted regular programming. Anchors delivered the update with shaking voices, some unable to hide their emotion. The headlines appeared within seconds, spreading across screens around the world. Outside Buckingham Palace, people began to gather. At first, just a few, then dozens, then hundreds. They came with flowers and candles, with worried faces and prayers on their lips. The same scene played out at Kensington Palace, where crowds assembled in silence, united in concern. Messages poured in from every corner of the globe. World leaders sent private notes. Celebrities posted tributes. Ordinary citizens flooded social media with words of support and hope. The response crossed all boundaries, political, social, and geographic. At that moment, everyone simply cared about a man who had always cared about them. Television stations replayed footage of William through the years. His wedding day, smiling at Kate with such joy. His first days as a father, cradling each newborn with tender pride. His visits to hospitals, homeless shelters, and disaster zones, always listening, always present. His speeches about mental health and conservation, spoken with genuine passion. People remembered his kindness, the way he made everyone feel seen and valued, the way he balanced duty with humanity. Kate's strength. Kate's hands trembled as she smoothed the blanket across William's chest. Such a small gesture, but it was all she could do, all she could control in a moment when everything else had spun wildly out of reach. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, and she focused on that sound, letting it ground her when panic threatened to pull her under. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him collapse again, that terrible moment when strength became fragility in an instant. So she stayed awake, watching him breathe, memorizing the rise and fall of his chest as if she could will his recovery through sheer determination. Down the hall, George, Charlotte, and Louis were being kept busy by staff who tried desperately to maintain normalcy. Kate had spoken to them earlier, kneeling down to their level, forcing her voice to stay steady, even as her heart shattered. "Daddy's not feeling well, but the doctors are helping him get better." George had looked at her with eyes too wise for his age, seeing through the careful calm she was trying to project. Charlotte had clung to her, silent and scared. Louis had asked when they could see him, and Kate had promised soon, not knowing if it was a promise she could keep. Being strong for them took everything she had. She couldn't fall apart, not where they could see, so she saved her tears for the nighttime hours, for the quiet moments alone beside William's bed when no one else was watching. Her mind drifted to other times, better times. She remembered Cambridge when they were just students navigating lectures and libraries. William had been different then, lighter somehow, less burdened. They would walk through town holding hands, anonymous in the crowd, stealing moments of ordinary life. She remembered their wedding day, standing beside him in Westminster Abbey, promising forever with the whole world watching. The weight of the vows had felt sacred then, meaningful in a way she couldn't fully grasp. Now she understood, for better or worse, in sickness and in health. Words that had seemed romantic had become achingly real. There have been so many moments since, royal tours where they had worked side by side, visiting communities and sharing the load of duty, quiet evenings at home with the children, playing games on the floor and reading bedtime stories. His hand finding hers during difficult public appearances, that silent communication that said, "We're in this together." Now she sat beside him, holding that same hand, and the silence was different, heavier. "You're not leaving me," she whispered, leaning close to his ear. "Not now, not like this." It wasn't a request. It was a command born from desperation and love so fierce it felt like it might consume her. She needed him to hear it, to understand that giving up wasn't an option. Their story wasn't finished. Their children needed their father. She needed her husband. The hours blurred together. Doctors came and went. Charles stopped by, his eyes red-rimmed, offering support she barely had the strength to acknowledge. Staff members knocked softly, bringing tea she didn't drink and updates she couldn't focus on. Beyond the palace walls, the world was watching. Kate knew this, felt the weight of it pressing down. Everyone wanted updates, reassurance, answers she didn't have. The public looked to the royal family for stability, for strength, and now that family was fractured. She thought about stepping out there, facing cameras and crowds, pretending everything would be fine. The idea exhausted her, but she also knew it might be necessary. Someone had to hold things together. Someone had to show that the monarchy could weather this storm. The irony didn't escape her. She, who had married into this family as an outsider, who had been scrutinized and questioned, was now becoming its anchor, not through grand speeches or public displays, but through quiet endurance, through showing up even when everything hurts, through refusing to break even when breaking seemed like the only option. A nurse came in to check William's vitals, moving efficiently around the equipment. Kate watched, searching the woman's face for any sign of good news or bad. The nurse offered a small, professional smile that revealed nothing. When they were alone again, Kate rested her head on the edge of the bed, still holding William's hand. She was so tired, bone-deep, exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix, but she stayed, because leaving felt like giving up, and giving up wasn't something she knew how to do. Outside, dawn was breaking over London. The crowds that had gathered in vigil were still there, smaller now but persistent. Candles had burned down to nothing, replaced by flowers piled against palace gates. Messages of hope and love covered every surface. The nation was watching Kate, though she didn't realize it yet. They saw her strength in the way she stayed silent, refusing to feed the media frenzy. A father's greatest fear. Charles stood at the window of his private study, staring out at nothing. His reflection in the glass looked older than it had just days ago. Lines of worry had deepened around his eyes, and his shoulders carried a weight that had nothing to do with the crown. Behind him, Camilla sat quietly, giving him space while staying close enough to reach if he needed her. She knew when to speak, and when silence was the greater comfort. This was a moment for silence. Finally, Charles turned away from the window, his composure cracking. His voice came out rough and strained. "I cannot lose him." The words hung in the air, raw and honest. Not a king speaking, but a father facing his deepest terror. Camilla rose and went to him, placing her hand on his arm. She didn't offer empty reassurances. They had both lived long enough to know that wanting something desperately didn't make it certain. Charles sank into his chair, suddenly looking exhausted. His mind traveled back through the years, sorting through memories like photographs in an album. He saw William as a boy, trying so hard to be brave at his mother's funeral. He saw him as a young man, uncertain about his path but determined to find it. He saw him as a husband and father, finally settling into the role he was born to fill. The pride Charles felt had always been mixed with guilt. Pride that his son had become such a remarkable man. Guilt that the life demanded of him left so little room for choice or freedom. Every decision William made was scrutinized. Every moment of his life belonged, in some way, to the nation. After the Queen passed away, William stepped up without hesitation. Charles had watched him take on more responsibility, handle more pressure, carry more weight. He had been grateful for the support, relieved to have someone he trusted completely by his side, but he had also worried, seeing how thin William was spreading himself. "I should have noticed," Charles said quietly. "I should have seen he was struggling." Camilla shook her head gently. "He wouldn't have let you see. That's who he is." Charles knew she was right. William had inherited that particular trait, the ability to carry burdens without complaint, to smile through exhaustion, to never let anyone see the cracks. It was noble and terrible in equal measure. The question of succession crept into Charles's thoughts uninvited. It was practical and necessary, yet thinking about it felt like betrayal. He was supposed to be worrying about his son's recovery, not about lines of succession and the stability of the monarchy. But the two were impossibly tangled together. If something happened to William, everything would shift. George was still so young, years away from being ready for such responsibility. The family would have to restructure, reorganize, and carry on somehow. The very thought made Charles feel sick. He had waited so long to be king. Decades of preparation and patience, always the heir, never the monarch. When his mother finally passed, he had taken the crown with a mixture of grief and duty. He had promised to serve faithfully, to honor her legacy, to keep the institution strong. But none of it mattered compared to this. He would give up the throne in an instant if it meant William would be all right. The monarchy could survive without him. He couldn't survive without his son. Charles made the decision quickly. His private secretary appeared at his door, schedule in hand, ready to discuss the coming week's engagements. Charles waved it away. "Cancel everything," he said firmly. "All of it." The secretary hesitated, mentioning important meetings, diplomatic obligations, events that had been planned for months. Charles cut him off. "I said cancel everything. My place is here. For once, duty could wait. The nation would understand. And if they didn't, that was a burden he was willing to bear. Nothing was more important than being present for his son right now. The palace issued a brief statement explaining that the king would be postponing his schedule to remain with family during this difficult time. The public response was immediate and supportive. People understood. A father's place was with his son, but Charles knew he needed to do more. The silence was allowing rumors to spread, fear to grow. People needed to hear from him directly, not through carefully worded press releases. He arranged to record a brief address from the palace. When the cameras were ready, he sat in front of them. No script prepared, just his heart on his sleeve. His voice was steady but emotional as he spoke to the nation. As a father, I ask for your understanding during this time. As your king, I ask for your prayers. It was rare for him to be so open, so vulnerable. The monarchy had always valued stoicism, the stiff upper lip that never wavered. The weight carried. George sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the closed door. Something was wrong. Adults kept saying everything was fine, but their smiles were too tight and their voices too careful. He was old enough to know when grown-ups were lying to make him feel better. Downstairs, Charlotte pressed her face against the drawing room window, watching for cars. She had been doing this for hours, hoping to see her father's familiar figure stepping out. Every time a vehicle approached, her heart would leap. Every time it wasn't him, she would sink a little deeper into disappointment. Louis was the youngest, still too small to fully grasp what was happening, but even he felt the strange heaviness in the house. The staff moved differently, quieter somehow. His mother's hugs lasted longer than usual, and when she pulled away, her eyes looked red and tired. Kate had gathered them together that first evening, kneeling down so she could meet their eyes. She had practiced what to say, rehearsed the words in her mind a dozen times, but when she actually faced them, everything felt inadequate. "Daddy's not feeling well," she had explained, keeping her voice as steady as possible. "The doctors are taking very good care of him." George had studied her face carefully, reading between the lines the way he had learned to do. At his age, he already understood more than most children about duty and responsibility. He had been told since he could remember that he was different, that his life would follow a particular path. Now that difference felt heavy and frightening. "Will Daddy be okay?" he asked quietly. Kate's breath caught. She wanted to promise yes, to give him the certainty he deserved, but she had also taught him to be honest, to face difficult truths with courage. So she pulled him close instead, holding him tight. "The doctors are doing everything they can. We have to hope and be brave." Charlotte had started crying then, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. She climbed into Kate's lap even though she was getting too big for it, needing the comfort of being small again. Louis followed, confused but wanting to be close to his family. They sat together on the floor in a tangle of arms and tears, finding strength in each other when everything else felt uncertain. Kate tried to maintain routines, breakfast at the usual time, lessons with their tutors, playtime in the garden, but normal felt impossible when nothing was normal. The children went through the motions, but their hearts weren't in it. Outside the palace gates, photographers waited with cameras ready, hoping for a glimpse of the royal children. Kate was fiercely protective. She made sure they stayed away from windows facing the street. Their outings were canceled. The world's curiosity would not be satisfied at the expense of her children's privacy. Friends stepped in to help, people Kate trusted completely, who understood the delicate balance needed right now. They came quietly through side entrances, bringing distractions and normalcy. They read stories and played games, giving Kate the freedom to be with William while knowing her children were cared for. George tried to be strong, mimicking the stoicism he had seen in the adults around him. He didn't cry where anyone could see. He helped Charlotte with her reading and made Louis laugh when the little one got sad. But at night, alone in his room, he whispered prayers he had learned from his great-grandmother, asking for his father to get better. Charlotte expressed her worry through art. She drew picture after picture of their family together, stick figures holding hands, everyone smiling. She gave them to her mother, offerings of hope wrapped in crayon and love. Kate taped each one to the wall beside William's hospital bed, surrounding him with his children's love. Louis asked questions constantly, his young mind struggling to make sense of why Daddy was gone. Where was he? When would he come back? Could they visit? Each question broke Kate's heart a little more. She answered as best she could, keeping explanations simple, promising that as soon as possible they would see him. One afternoon, Kate brought them to a private room in the palace where they could record video messages for William. The staff set up a camera, and one by one the children spoke to their father. George went first, standing straight and trying not to cry. "I love you, Daddy. Please come home soon." Charlotte sang him a song she had learned, her sweet voice wavering but determined. Louis blew kisses at the camera, not fully understanding but knowing somehow that his daddy needed them. Kate played the videos for William later that evening, holding her phone close to his ear. She wanted him to hear their voices, to know how much they needed him, to have something worth fighting for. The children's innocence became the household's anchor, while adults wrestled with fear and worst-case scenarios. George and Charlotte, their simple hope was contagious. When Kate felt herself drowning in despair, she thought of their faces and found reasons to keep going. When Charles felt the weight becoming unbearable, he remembered his grandchildren's belief that everything would be all right, and it paid off. Stick around. The world holds its breath. The palace had gone silent. No statements beyond the initial announcement. No updates on William's condition. No photographs or reassurances. The vacuum of information became its own kind of torture for a public desperate for answers. In that silence, rumors flourished like weeds. Anonymous sources claimed his condition was critical. Others insisted he was already improving. Social media exploded with conflicting reports, each one shared thousands of times before anyone could verify its truth. Fear and hope battled for dominance in the collective consciousness. Outside Buckingham Palace, the crowd had grown from dozens to thousands. People stood shoulder to shoulder, strangers united by shared concern. Flowers piled so high against the gates that staff had to create additional spaces for them. Teddy bears, cards, candles, and handwritten prayers covered every available surface. Similar scenes played out across Britain and throughout the Commonwealth. In Australia, vigils formed in city squares. In Canada, buildings were lit in royal colors. In small villages and major cities alike, people gathered to wait together, finding comfort in community during the uncertainty. The messages of support came from every corner of the globe. The White House released a statement expressing solidarity and offering prayers. The Vatican sent personal words from the Pope himself. Commonwealth leaders issued statements one after another, their concern transcending politics and protocol. This wasn't about diplomacy, it was human compassion on a massive scale. World leaders who had worked with William shared personal anecdotes. They spoke of his warmth, his genuine interest in people, his ability to make everyone feel valued. Environmental activists recalled his passionate advocacy for conservation. Mental health organizations remembered his tireless work to break stigma. Veterans talked about his respect and dedication to military families. The outpouring revealed something profound. William had touched more lives than anyone realized. He had used his platform not for glory but for service, and now the world was reflecting that care back to him. Television anchors grew emotional, delivering updates, some openly crying on air. Talk show hosts dedicated segments to sharing favorite moments from William's public life. Social media filled with videos of his interactions with children, his easy laughter, the tender way he looked at Kate. People were remembering why they cared so much. Days passed with agonizing slowness. Each morning brought desperate hope for good news. Each evening brought disappointment when nothing changed. The tension was unbearable. A collective breath held too long, lungs burning with the strain of waiting. Inside the hospital, Kate remained at William's bedside while the world speculated about his fate. She was unaware of the massive response happening beyond those walls. Her universe had narrowed to one room, one bed, one heartbeat. Then, on the fourth morning, something shifted. William's eyes fluttered open. Just for a moment, just barely. But Kate saw it. Her heart leapt as she leaned forward, squeezing his hand. His fingers squeezed back, weakly but deliberately. It was the smallest gesture, but it meant everything. She called for the doctors, her voice shaking with cautious hope. They came quickly, conducting tests, checking monitors, asking questions. William's responses were slow and tired, but they were responses. He was coming back. The medical team gathered afterward to discuss his progress. Their faces showed careful optimism, emphasizing that he wasn't out of danger yet. Recovery would be slow. There were still risks of complications, setbacks, relapses. But for the first time since the collapse, they used the word encouraging. Kate allowed herself a moment of relief before the fear crept back in. She had seen him wake up, yes, but what if he slipped away again? What if this was temporary? She couldn't let herself celebrate too soon, couldn't let her guard down when he still needed her vigilance. Charles arrived within the hour, his face transforming when he saw William's eyes open and aware. Father and son looked at each other, and words became unnecessary. Charles took his son's hand, and for a long moment, they simply held on. That evening, the family gathered in the private chapel at Windsor Castle. Charles, Camilla, Kate, Anne, and a few trusted others knelt together in prayer. The chapel was quiet except for whispered words of gratitude and continued pleading for complete healing. Charles decided the public deserved to know, not details of William's condition, but acknowledgement of their support. He recorded a brief statement, his voice thick with emotion, but also carrying a note of hope that hadn't been there before. "Your prayers and kindness have sustained our family through the darkest of days. We are grateful beyond words." The response was immediate. Church bells rang across Britain. News anchors smiled through tears as they shared the update. Social media erupted with celebration and relief. The flowers at the palace gates doubled overnight, now expressing joy instead of just sorrow. People remembered William's own words from years ago, during an interview about duty and service. He had spoken quietly but firmly about his commitment to the role he was born into. "I will serve until my last breath," he had said simply. Those words took on new meaning now. They revealed a man who understood sacrifice, who took his responsibilities seriously, who would give everything he had to fulfill his purpose. But they also showed someone who needed protecting, who couldn't be allowed to pour himself out until there was nothing left. The crisis became more than just a medical emergency. It transformed into a moment of reflection about what the monarchy meant in modern times. Not distant figures in palaces, but real people carrying impossible burdens with grace. William's vulnerability made him more relatable, more human, more loved than any amount of perfection ever could. As news of his improvement spread, the mood shifted from grief to gratitude, from fear to hope. The world had watched and waited, united in concern for a man who had dedicated his life to others. And their gratitude wouldn't be complete if William doesn't assure them that he was all right. The voice that broke the silence. The statement came, released without fanfare or advance warning, just a simple post on the official royal channels, but within minutes, the world stopped to read it. The words were William's own, not crafted by advisors or polished by press secretaries, but written in his voice, raw and honest in a way the public had rarely seen from any member of the royal family. He thanked the doctors first, naming them specifically, acknowledging their skill and dedication. He expressed gratitude that felt personal rather than obligatory, recognizing the people who had fought alongside him during those critical hours when everything hung in balance. Then he turned his attention to his family. He wrote about Kate's unwavering presence, how she had been his anchor when he felt himself drifting. He mentioned his father's support, the way Charles had set aside everything to be there. He spoke of his children with tender emotion, admitting how thoughts of them had pulled him back when letting go would have been easier. But the most powerful words were saved for the people. William thanked everyone who had gathered outside hospitals and palaces, who had lit candles and said prayers, who had sent messages of hope from every corner of the globe. He acknowledged their concern with genuine humility, seeming almost overwhelmed by the scale of love directed toward him. "I have been reminded that none of us walk alone," he wrote. "Your kindness carried me through the darkness." The simplicity of those words hit harder than any grand speech could have. Here was the future king, stripped of formality, speaking human to human about fear and gratitude and the connections that bind us all together. The palace followed the written statement with a photograph. It had been taken just hours earlier, in a private room away from medical equipment and monitoring devices. William sat in a comfortable chair, still looking tired and thinner than before, but unmistakably present. Kate stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, and the smile on her face told its own story. She was smiling, but tears glistened in her eyes. Relief and lingering fear mixed together in an expression so honest, it felt almost intrusive to witness. This wasn't a posed royal portrait. This was a wife barely holding herself together, grateful beyond measure that her husband was still here. The photograph circulated instantly. News outlets ran it on front pages. Social media users shared it millions of times, adding their own words of relief and joy. People who had been holding their breath for days finally exhaled, feeling the collective tension release like a snapped wire. Across Britain, church bells rang again, but this time in celebration rather than concern. Strangers hugged on the streets. The crowds at palace gates cheered and cried and held their candles high. The wait was over. He was going to be okay. But even in the relief, everyone understood something fundamental had changed. William had always been dutiful, perhaps to a fault. He had inherited his grandmother's sense of service, that deep belief that personal desires came second to public responsibility. He had pushed himself relentlessly, taking on more and more, convinced that he could handle whatever was asked of him. Now he understood the cost of that approach. His body had rebelled against demands that exceeded human capacity. The warning had been delivered in the most frightening way possible, and he couldn't ignore it. In his statement, he made a promise. He would slow down. He would prioritize his health. He would spend more time with his family, recognizing that being present for them was just as important as any royal duty. It was a radical admission from someone whose entire life had been defined by obligation. The palace announced a reduced schedule. Engagements would be carefully selected rather than automatically accepted. Rest would be built into his calendar instead of squeezed between commitments. It was a new approach, one that acknowledged limits rather than pretending they didn't exist. The family gathered at Windsor that weekend, all of them together in a way they hadn't been in months. No formal dinner, no official agenda, just people who loved each other, grateful to still have the chance to be in the same room. George, Charlotte, and Louis were finally allowed to see their father properly. They climbed onto his lap carefully, as if he might break, their young faces serious with concentration. William held them close, and Kate watched from across the room, her hand pressed to her mouth, overwhelmed by the simple beauty of it. Charles sat with his son later that evening, just the two of them in the library. They talked for hours about things they had never quite put into words before. The weight of the crown, the impossible balance between duty and humanity, the fear that no matter how hard you try, it will never be enough. "I'm sorry," Charles said quietly, "for not seeing how much you were carrying." William shook his head. "I should have asked for help." They were both right. They were both learning. The crisis had cracked open conversations that had been avoided for too long, allowing honesty to flow where once there had only been formal courtesy. The trust between them deepened. Charles made it clear that he would shoulder more of the burden, that William didn't need to prove anything to anyone. William allowed himself to accept that support, recognizing that strength sometimes meant admitting you couldn't do everything alone. Kate emerged from the ordeal transformed in the public eye. She had always been admired for her grace and style, but now people saw something deeper. They saw steel beneath the elegance, fierce devotion beneath the practiced smile. She had held her family together through the worst imaginable circumstances, and she had done it with quiet determination that commanded respect. Articles were written about her strength. Women especially felt a connection to her experience, the terror of watching someone you love suffer, the exhaustion of being strong for everyone else, the isolation of private pain playing out under public scrutiny. She became more than a princess. She became someone people related to on a fundamental human level. The monarchy itself shifted subtly in the public consciousness. The stiff formality that had defined it for generations gave way to something more accessible. People had seen the family's pain and recognized themselves in it. They had witnessed vulnerability and found it more compelling than perfection ever was. The affection directed toward the royals now carried deeper understanding. They weren't just symbols or celebrities. They were people navigating impossible circumstances, doing their best with the cards they had been dealt, making mistakes and learning from them just like everyone else. William returned to public life slowly, carefully. His first appearance drew massive crowds, people lining the streets just to see him, to reassure themselves that he was really okay. He walked among them, shaking hands and accepting flowers, visibly moved by the reception. Kate walked beside him, as she always did, but now everyone understood what that meant. Not just a wife accompanying her husband, but a partner who had proven she would stand beside him through anything. Their connection was visible in every glance, every subtle touch, every moment of silent communication.